Hi, I'm Ryan Davis.
And I'm Kieran Schmidt.
And this is Out of Office, a travel podcast.
The seat taken.
Hey, Kieran.
Now, Ryan, I remember a time. I don't know if you remember. If you close your eyes, you take yourselves back to maybe the first, maybe 3 years ago, our first 50 episodes or so. And I had gotten back from Peru, and I said, Ryan, I've got a trilogy worth of material here.
That's a lot of Peru.
And there's episodes and episodes of you saying, oh, what's this going to be? A whole Peru podcast now? And Kieran keeps going on and on about Peru. And yet here we find ourselves yet again. This is your second episode about Peru.
Yeah, well, this is about Peru, but it's about the Andes in particular, which extend beyond Peru. I think it's 7 South American countries the Andes cover. So this is quite a big mountain range. So,
Ryan, who are you interviewing today?
Today, we've got Kim MacQuarrie on the podcast. He's an author, a documentary filmmaker, whose 2 books, The Last Days of the Incas and Life and Death in the Andes, were both books that I read on my trip to Peru, and I'm so excited to have him on today to, definitely talk a bit about Peru, but sort of expand and also learn about why the Andes is so important.
Well, Ryan, before we get to your interview, of course, I want to do a check-in here. You and I were talking about taking our first trip together, and I've started to formulate the options. We've narrowed it down to a certain radius of flight time and expense. And luckily, there are some national park lands that fall within that. So I was thinking, now, I think it's debatable whether we should do a full episode on our co-trip planning, and maybe I can pitch you ideas on where we should go and we consider the benefits or costs. Or I am open to you telling me, well, that sounds interesting, Kieran, but maybe just interesting enough for the A block here. Maybe that's not the meat of a future episode.
Yeah, I think that's more of let's kick
A block
it off.
Material.
Yeah. I don't think people need to have us go through all the different ramadas in Kentucky.
Listen, if I'm going to a national park property, I want to stay on that property.
That's true.
I've never seen a ramada in a national
You're
park.
a Marriott guy. I apologize for that.
Listen, if anything, I'm Hyatt and above. Well, Ryan, I am extremely anxious to learn about, I obviously, by visiting Peru, knew a fair amount about the Andes in Peru specifically, but I didn't think of it as sort of the full breadth, the chain of mountains across South America. So I'm super anxious to learn, along with everybody else, about how that's shaped the culture. And hopefully, is there a little geology in this interview?
There's a little geology, absolutely. Yeah.
I love some travel geology.
Yeah, no, you do. So I think you're going to enjoy this. It's some really interesting stories from the Andes and of Kim's travels there. And Kim has really gotten to spend a lot of time in South America and has a lot to say. So we should jump to the interview.
Before we do, I just want to ask, how's your pronunciation? Are we going to be embarrassed here?
He only laughs at me one time.
That's pretty good.
Yeah. So that's not bad.
So you edited it out the other 25 times.
I did. Well, I was really careful to let him say the name of the sites, So I
smart. Very smart. All right. Well, I think it's time to take off.
Cabin crew.
Flight attendants, prepare for takeoff, please.
Well, welcome, Kim, to Out of Office. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm a big fan of your books, and I'm excited to hear a bit about your travels around the Andes.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So how did you become sort of a South American traveler? What drew you to South America?
Well, that's an interesting story. I mean, it goes back, as people have asked me over the years, and I always kind of, really plumbing down into it, I attribute it to books. When I was a kid, I grew up in Las Vegas, Nevada. It was pretty small back then, the city, very hot in the summers. And so I used to read a lot, and especially in elementary school, you read voraciously. And I read a lot of books that were both fiction and nonfiction. And one of my favorite authors was Edgar Rice Burroughs, and not so much for the Tarzan series, but he wrote a series of books called Inside the Earth. It was about this scientist who drilled down through the core of the Earth, and it was hollow inside. And inside was this fantastic world of jungles and naked women and dinosaurs and things like that. So I like to say by the time I was 10, I'd really traveled quite a bit, pretty much beyond the solar system and all over the world through books. And I think that kind of instilled in me this idea that there was more out there than Las Vegas, Nevada. And eventually I majored in biology, got a master's in anthropology, but I studied abroad in France when I was a junior in college. And so that studying abroad, you learn another language, you live with another family, you learn a different culture. And at the time I was doing that, I was torn between either going to Europe or going to South America. So I was already interested in South America. And I decided when I went there, I'd go to France first and then find a way to go down to South America. So when I was in graduate school, there was a program, study abroad program down in Lima, Peru. And you could do a lot of your coursework, your master's, graduate work down there. And also you could do field work. And so I decided to go down to Peru. So I'd always been interested. And I'd been down to Mexico earlier in my college career. And so I was really fascinated by Mexico and what lay south. I traveled down to Central America a little bit. But when I really bit the bullet, I got in this program, flew down to Peru. And that's when I started to learn about South America.
And Lima has changed a lot since then, right? I mean, you write about the curfews and things like that. And having just come from there, it's hard to imagine the city like that.
Yeah, I mean, Peru has changed a lot. This is 30 years ago or so. So, I mean, fortunately for Peru, they've cut poverty in half in the last few decades through a variety of economic policies, that kind of thing. So there's a lot more poverty when I was down there. And when I arrived in Peru, it was right in the middle of the Shining Path insurgency, the Maoist group that were based up in the Andes. And, when I got into the airport, it was curfew. If you went out after it was 11 o'clock at night, you got shot until 5 a.m. And if you were in a taxi, you had a white flag on the antenna. And so there was tanks and soldiers and that kind of thing. So when I arrived in Lima, it was after midnight. So it was like a convoy that went from the airport into the town. So, it was a different world.
So when I was doing research for the trip, I picked up a couple books written by young Peruvian novelists, and so many of them were about the Shining Path or had to do with the Shining Path, and it seems like a really formative experience for a lot of people there.
Yeah, if you grew up in the Shining Path came to its peak in the late 1980s, throughout the 1980s. So if anybody grew up during that time, it was a revolutionary movement that almost toppled the government, came very close to doing that. And it was had a major impact on society then. And it was a time of a lot of fear and a lot of distrust. And that only ended in the early 1990s, actually, when they caught the leader of the Shining Path, Abimael Guzman, who just passed away a year or so ago.
What you write about the capture in the book, and it's a hell of a story, but I don't want to give too much of that away. I'd like to start sort of broader and just sort of ask you, what makes the Andes Mountains so unique?
Well, the Andes have a bunch of accolades attributed to them. It's the longest mountain chain in the world, continental mountain chain, and about 5,000 feet long. So it goes through a very diverse, latitudes, longitudes, and it's a massive mountain chain in many ways. A lot of the peaks are over 20,000 feet. I think the highest peak, Mount Aconcagua in Chile, is almost 23,000 feet. So only surpassed by the Himalayas, but it's a very formidable chain of mountains and because they're so massive, they create a lot of different eco zones. So there's a lot of biodiversity down there in that part of the world and on the western South America. And that's because the elevations change so much. Different animals and plants have evolved to inhabit certain niches. And then the various cultures that have evolved in Peru over thousands and thousands of years have adapted to those kind of ecological zones and learned how to, tap into those zones to get resources. So they're just it's a massive mountain chain with huge biodiversity, lots of cultural diversity, and it's just very beautiful as well.
And I know that you lived in Peru and you traveled extensively around South America. How did you go about, planning your travels for the book you were writing, Life and Death in the Andes?
Yeah, I'd always had that idea for a book on that subject, meaning traveling from one end to the other for a number of years. And so it really began by pitching my editor, Simon Schuster, the idea, because that's kind of how all books start, really. And so he liked the idea. And once, I pitched the book and got the advance, I hunkered down and did research and decide what the route would be and that kind of thing. I decided to go from, the very far tip of the Andes up in the north and travel all the way down to the south and stop in different places that I had interest in different stories along the way, kind of like jewels along a long piece of rope or something like that. There's so many stories in the Andes, that you can take your pick. It's a cornucopia of potential stories, but I kind of planned out a route that would take me from the north to the south and do a side trip to the Galapagos Islands, which were formed by the same forces that the Andes Mountains, are being formed by continually. And I started there up in the north.
And you talk about the biodiversity of the Andes. The Galapagos Islands are an incredible example of that. You write in the book that the bird species varied so much that Darwin thought he was looking at the same birds, but they were actually, looking at different birds, but they're actually the same species. They had just adapted on separate islands to be that different.
Yeah, I mean, the Galapagos are famous for a bunch of reasons, but one of the big ones is that's where Charles Darwin stopped on this voyage on HMS Beagle when he went around the world for 5 years as a young naturalist. And he started up in England. He went down to South America around the tip, of Patagonia, and then eventually up the coast and then headed out, and they stopped in the Galapagos Islands. And he was observing and thinking, and at the time, evolution didn't exist, the idea of evolution, and he didn't know about evolution during that part of the trip. In fact, not till didn't really started cropping up, into the latter stages. But the Galapagos were formative for him because he landed on this chain of barren islands, and as naturalists did back then, he would start collecting things just kind of automatically because they were making collections to take back to the museums in England. And the famous one is he collected a bunch of finches, and on the mainland there was one species of finch. In the Galapagos there was like 7, and he started to notice that, like, how come there's a finch on this one island has a big beak and another one has a thinner beak and another one a different size? Like, why? How did that all happen? And that's really kind of what started to get his thought processes going. And he had his notebook and he started jotting down ideas. And that's how he eventually stumbled across the idea of, I wonder if there was an original ancestor somehow blew its way out here to the islands. And since the habitats are a little bit different on each island, that somehow they adapted. How they changed, morphology changed. How did that happen? So that kind of kicked off for him in a big way in the Galapagos Islands. And it took all the way getting back to England to really kind of start sketching out those ideas. And then he spent over 2 decades writing up his ideas before he actually published them.
And there's some really fun details in the book about how, I didn't know that Darwin basically paid his way on board, right? Like he was sort of a pro bono naturalist. And when he was collecting species, he didn't collect enough. And so he had to go to everybody else on the ship and be like, what did you all take?
Yeah, it was going back to the finches that, he didn't know about evolution at the time. So he would collect different species and you're supposed to label them. And when he finally kind of hit upon this idea of evolution, that a species could change through time depending, impacted by their habitat, he went back and by now he was back in London and he went through his boxes of collections and stuff. And to his horror, he realized that these finches he collected, he hadn't even put down the names, a lot of times the names of the islands. So where did they come from? He couldn't determine that. So he was trying to ask other travelers and so on and so forth. So he was an amateur naturalist when he started. And then by the time he ended up in London 5 years later, he was a professional biologist. But he learned by hook and by crook. And, he made mistakes and that kind of thing. And the irony is that he's famous for his finches, but he actually never used the example of finches in his famous book on evolution because he had not taken enough correct data. He never found out which islands these came from. So he knew they came from different ones, but he couldn't pin it down. So he didn't use that example. And only later, once this theory was published, did other scientists go there and look at the finches and go, oh, these are a perfect example of what Darwin was talking about.
And you write that, this the trip obviously really opened Darwin's mind to these ideas, but the captain that he spent a lot of time with on the ship actually was reinforced his ideas of creationism on the trip.
Yeah, it was like the future battle. I say, well, Darwin didn't know about evolution until after he got back after his voyage. He was only trying to piece it together in the latter half. and the captain of the ship was Captain Fitzroy, and he was a very religious man, and they were very good buddies at first, and actually during the entire voyage. But Fitzroy would get off on, in Patagonia and go at Darwin, and Darwin would be looking at these, exposure outcrops of, different layered stratigraphy of, different depositions of deposits over time. And Darwin understood that this must represent time. This must represent millions of years, potentially, not the 7,000 years that, were in the Bible, and since the flood. And Fitzroy was very religious. He took everything literally out of the Bible. And so he saw those same geological strata, and he said, oh, here's examples of the flood, and here's examples of when, Noah must have sailed in his boat, and this kind of thing. So they had very different ways of approaching knowledge. So Fitzroy was, accepted knowledge from a book, and Darwin was trying to use the scientific method to try to gather data and use a hypothesis and then test the hypothesis and try to arrive at truth that way. So unfortunately for Darwin, when he got back and published the Voyage of the Beagle and his book on evolution, when Fitzroy read it, Fitzroy was aghast and was deeply sorrowful that he had given this young naturalist a ride around the world, only to come out and in his opinion, blaspheme what was in the Bible.
Yeah, no, that is definitely one of the many interesting parts of the Darwin story that you tell. I'd like to talk a bit about Lake Titicaca. Now, I was lucky enough to be able to take the train and from Arequipa to Cusco, and we stopped on the way and got to go out into Lake Titicaca. I'd love to hear a little bit about that community on the floating islands and how that developed and how that is. And how they're distinct from the Inca.
Well, I'm glad you got to go there. Yeah, it's a fascinating area of the world, and Lake Titicaca is it's the highest navigable lake in the world. It's 12,500 feet in elevation. It's just a beautiful, beautiful lake and a beautiful area surrounded by mountain chains with icy mountains and that kind of thing. But the group you're talking about, they're called the Uros, and they live on the Uros Islands, and people think about South America, or at least Western South America, and they think about civilizations, I think automatically of the Inca Empire. But the Inca Empire was only the last of, a string of empires and states that emerged over the previous, 5,000, 10,000 years in Peru. Agriculture was discovered simultaneously around the world in 6 different areas, 10,000 years ago, roughly. And one of those areas was the Andes Mountains and the Amazon jungle, so that part of the Western South America. And so that gave birth to a whole series of cultures and the stratification of society. So the Incas were preceded by thousands of years of previous cultures, and many of which created the inventions that are later attributed to the Incas, like how to cut stone. And they had these mnemonic quipu cords they could store information on. Those were invented thousands of years before the Incas came along. So the Incas were kind of like the Roman conquerors of the various cultures, much as the Romans had conquered, a large portion of Europe. So anyhow, getting back to that Lake Titicaca, so the Uros Islands, so there's many cultures that the Incas conquered. So it was very much a polyglot empire, meaning that the Incas would conquer an empire, the people would retain their native languages, they would learn Quechua, which is the administrative language, and which is what the Incas spoke. So that was kind of the Latin of the Roman Empire, Quechua. And they were able to wield this or create and control this empire that stretched over roughly, almost 3,000 miles across the Andes, all the way down through Lake Titicaca, down and halfway down into Chile. And so in the middle of that southern area is Lake Titicaca, and there was a very small group of people called the Urus who lived on these, of all things, floating islands in Lake Titicaca, because Lake Titicaca has normal islands, like, geological islands. But the Urus people built these islands out of totora reed, and it's a kind of bulrush, and they would gather these reeds and make these giant mats and put them one on top of another, and they'd create a stable platform, and they'd make houses out of totora reeds. And nobody really knows if that was a distinct group originally with their own language, but by the time people started taking notes, early Spanish explorers and that kind of thing, the people there spoke Aymara, which is there was an Aymara kingdom that the Incas had conquered down in that area of the world, which is now Bolivia and southern Peru. So all people know is that even in the time of the Incas, there were people out there living on the lake on these artificial islands made out of totora reed, and they would drive the Incas crazy because the Incas, they would conquer an area and they would implement taxation. And if they went out to the islands to collect their taxes, all the people there had to do is unmoor their island and go float away someplace else. So the Incas were annoyed that they couldn't pin these people down. And the Spaniards very much the same. When they wanted to control people, they'd go out there, and if they bothered anybody, they just unmoor their island and go float someplace else. So it was a pretty good strategy.
Yeah, it's an interesting place, and our guide told us that the folks there used to dress in much darker colors, but as tourists started to come to the islands on day trips and excursions, tourists really responded to the bright, colorful clothing. And so that sort of became the norm. It's interesting, going to those islands now, I wonder how many folks actually still sort of live out there and how much of that is sort of just tourist infrastructure. Do you know?
I don't know the percentage, but over time it's declined. And so a lot of the islands, as you say, are a lot of them are tourist traps. I mean, the boats come out there and people take pictures and that kind of thing. And so, they're owned by people. Some live on the mainland. I say they're Aymara speaking, so the Aymara people live on the mainland and they live on these islands. And then, as I mentioned in the book, I stayed in a quote unquote, totora reed hotel, which is basically a totora reed house that they rented out, very small. But, it's a combination of, making a living out there through tourism, and tourism is pretty huge in South America. So that's a natural tourist attraction. But the interesting thing, if you go out there and actually, the tourist boats go out there, spend an hour, everybody jumps out, takes photos, and people are out there doing their thing. And then they go back to the mainland and go home. And if you stay out there for some time, overnight and, spend some nights out there, it's a whole different kind of place because there are people out there at night living on the islands, and, there's not a whole lot of lights out there. And at night, it's a pretty cool experience because you're so high up, 12,500 feet already on Lake Titicaca, that the Milky Way is pretty fantastic. There's hardly any light pollution, and it's just a very beautiful and different kind of experience than if you take a tourist boat out there and, spend an hour taking photos and stuff. So it's a melange, like so many South American cultures and communities. There's a melange of things going on. There's the past and the present, and there's tourism and, ancient cultures threaded through there, and modern Peruvian culture. So it's a mishmash out there, but it's a fascinating area nevertheless. And the history of these islands goes way back to the time of the Incas, at least.
Yeah, I was jealous that you got to spend the night there. Although I think the Wi-Fi probably wasn't great. Well, when you talk about explorers, I think there's no single more modern explorer who's left mark on Peru like Hiram Bingham, and I wonder if you can talk a little bit about him and how his legacy has changed over the years.
Well, it's a good question. Everybody's legacy changes over the years. I mean, a good one to start with is Francisco Pizarro, who led the Spanish conquest of the Inca Empire, and then after that conquest, they took over, and for hundreds of years there were statues of Pizarro, in different places in Peru and Lima because it was controlled by the Spanish elite. And now there's if you go to Lima, Peru, there's no statue. Well, there's actually only one statue left because he's not regarded in the same way. Now that Peru is more of a polyglot, country, it's independent republic. And so Pizarro's legacy has changed over time. And Hiram Bingham is in very similar light there. Bingham's a fascinating individual. He's the one credited with discovering Machu Picchu. And he was born on the island of Hawaii and eventually went to Yale University, became a historian, and he traveled down to South America, down to Chile to go to a conference back in 1908. And on the way back, stopped in Peru, which was his first time in Peru, and went up to the Cusco in the Andes. And he heard this story about this lost city of the Incas, because the Incas, after Pizarro conquered them, one of the emperors, renegade emperors, went down to the Amazon jungle and took his followers, and they created a second Inca empire and fought the Spaniards for another 3 decades before they finally succumbed. And he heard about this lost capital that this renegade empire had, was situated in, called Vilcabamba. And then he went back to the United States, and he became obsessed by trying to be the one to find this lost Inca capital located somewhere in the Amazon jungle. But you know what? I'm realizing I didn't answer your question. I kind of varied there and didn't talk about his legacy. So
no, I think this is a perfect chance, because in your book you talk about his discovery of Machu Picchu, and he wrote several sort of narratives of this. And in the very first narrative, he mentions that someone had carved their initials there. I forget, it was like 10 or 15 years prior. And throughout his various narratives, he sort of erases that person.
Yeah, it's very true. I mean, Bingham was a very ambitious, interesting individual. I say he grew up in Hawaii. His parents were missionaries. His grandparents were missionaries. So he came from a very much a fire and brimstone kind of background, kind of repressed. And at first he thought he wanted to go become a minister. And then when he went to college, he changed his mind, got interested in more things. He went to college on the mainland, started to broaden his interests. And yet he went to a sequence of, he went to a prep school, he went to Yale, eventually went to Berkeley, he went to Harvard, and he was always kind of surrounded by wealthier students, right? So he had a little bit of a chip on his shoulder. He had a need to prove himself. So when he got the idea of trying, as a historian, of trying to find the lost capital of the Inca Empire, the final capital of the Inca Empire from the Rump Empire, of the Guerrilla Empire, he became obsessed by finding that, and he went down there, and by goodness, he found it. He didn't know exactly what he found. He found Machu Picchu, and he thought Machu Picchu was this lost city of Vilcabamba. He was wrong about that, but nevertheless, he was the first outsider to stumble across the ruins of Machu Picchu and to recognize their importance and to publish about them, which made them known around the world. But when he first arrived, he arrived by himself with the help of a native guide who lived down below, because Machu Picchu is like 2,000 feet above the valley below.
And he didn't have the Bingham bus to take him up there.
No, there's no Bingham. That comes much later, Brian, much later. Until much later. No, he walked up he was led up a trail by this guide, Melchor Arteaga, who lived down below and knew about the ruins. And they got up on top of this peak. And here are these ruins, some of which had been cleared and some were covered in, brambles and that kind of thing. And there were 3 Peruvian families living up there and farming in these areas that the Incas had crops and that kind of thing. So clearly they'd already been discovered, whatever they were. He had no idea what they were. And he was smart enough he took one of the early Polaroid cameras down there on a tripod, and he spent a number of hours taking the very first photos of Machu Picchu. And interestingly enough, the photos he took were the photos of the uncleared part of the ruins.
Right.
He never pointed the camera at the cleared part of the ruins, or at the family living there, that kind of thing. Because
he would have been very good on Instagram. He would have gotten it. Yeah.
I think from the get-go, he saw himself as the hero explorer, right? Finding undiscovered ruins, and they were in many ways, but still, there was 3 families living up there. They were happily farming the area. And one of the places he found this massive, one of the cut Inca stones. He saw there was somebody had scrawled their name in charcoal there, Lizarraga, and it had a date next to it, 1902. So when Bingham was writing down in his book, he goes, "Oh, this was discovered by this guy named Lizarraga, whoever he is, in 1902. It's not me." And then gradually over time, he actually started to professionally publish and write books about it. He basically erased, not only Lizarraga, but anybody else had, been up there, and then said, "I am the one who discovered Machu Picchu." And in a way, he knew he was the one who had discovered it, quote unquote, scientifically and broadcast it to the rest of the world. But he kind of, it's like those photos the Soviets had of their, when people fell out of favor, they would airbrush the people away until just like Stalin was the only person there, and he was the founder of, the revolution or something like that. Oh, Bingham kind of did something similar psychologically.
And do we know the name of the boy that he gave the soul to walk him up to the ruins?
Oh gosh, you've got it there. He has the first name in his book, and I know in another book somebody has it, and I just don't remember.
You could get a lot more for a soul back then than I think you can now.
But after that, the boy becomes lost to history. But he went up with Sergeant Carrasco actually he was accompanied by 2 people. He had Melchor Arteaga took him up there, who was a farmer down in the valley below, and he was assigned a a policeman for the expedition by the Peruvian government, Sergeant Carrasco. And so Carrasco went up there, and so did Arteaga. And then they found this family up there, and this young boy took him around, guided him around.
Yeah, it's quite a story, and I think when you are in Peru, you see his name everywhere. So it's interesting to get a little background on that. I wonder, are there kind of less traveled places in the Andes that you think tourists should consider? I know I don't want to. We're not a big enough show. We're gonna create a tourist problem here. But I'm curious if in all your travels, there are some places that are less traveled that you're like, wow, this should get more attention.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, the Andes are immense. I come from the state of Nevada, and the state of Nevada, the population is all clustered down the very southern tip, Las Vegas, and over in the Reno Tahoe area. And if you fly over Nevada, there's like nothing down there. You fly over, it looks like when the Spaniards first arrived, or pre-Hispanic times. Like, it's a very underpopulated state, and the Andes are very much like that. So there's these tourist destinations, and rightfully so. Cusco was the former capital of the Inca Empire, so it's a beautiful city, and that's where it all started. So that's a natural destination. Obviously, you're going to fly into Lima if you're talking about Peru, and then going out to Machu Picchu, which is famous for lots of good reasons. And then there's other places, Lake Titicaca, and there's these these central destinations. But I mean, the Andes are 5,000 feet long. We're talking about just a fraction of what's out there. And even you look at the Inca Trail, the Inca Trail's famous, and you think, oh, as you do the Inca Trail, so yeah, how long it took me 4 days, and I hiked from the Sacred Valley, to Machu Picchu. Well, the Inca Trail was just a very tiny little section of an extensive network of roads the Incas put in, throughout their empire. That I think it's like 38,000 miles of roads from the north to the south. Just a complete web work, and a lot of those roads are still extant. Meaning that they still exist, at least remnants of them in different places, not just in southern Peru, but all over, up into the north. And you can hike along vast stretches of those areas, and there's just nobody else out there. Maybe there's a little village or a hamlet with somebody, tending an alpaca or something like that. But I mean, it's kind of like Nevada in the sense that there's vast stretches of the Andes where it's just remote. And you start talking about going down to the Patagonian area of the Andes, and boy, that seems like going to Mars, and remote valleys, and beautiful lakes and forests, and you can kayak, and there's nobody there. So I guess what I'm trying to say is there's the central stopping points that are famous, and then there's the rest, and there's so much of the rest that's just wild and beautiful that it's hard for me to pinpoint any place, but it's amazing how much there is that's not sampled, right? From north to south. There's a whole tour, for example, up in northern Peru. I went on, the Peruvian government put this on. It's called the Northern Kingdoms of Peru, because everybody's heard about the Inca Empire. But there's all these previous cultures I was telling you about that go back thousands of years, the Chimu culture and these different groups. And there's you go up the northern part, and part of it's when I describe my book, Meeting Thor Heyerdahl, the famous Kon-Tiki explorer. He was in his early 70s, excavating up in northern Peru among these northern kingdoms. And there's just pyramids all over the place. I mean, I'm talking about adobe pyramids, but there's just, there's ruins everywhere. You fly over an airplane, there's ruins here, and there's ancient kingdoms there, and the Andes stretching around there. There's just these vast expanses, really immense topography with cultures overlaying that nobody's there right now, right? So take your pick.
There's a lot more to explore, is what you're saying.
I guess in a nutshell, I should have said it that way.
Well, that's great. So look, I couldn't have you on the podcast without asking you a bit about your book, The Last of the Incas, which I really loved, and I read during my trip, and I got to know Manco Inca II a bit from your book, and I was wondering if you could talk a little about who he was and sort of how he ties into some of the big sites around Cusco, because that's a really exciting period in history.
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, it's a very epic story, that a sad story, but an epic story, the conquest of the Inca Empire, and it goes back to how did 168 Spaniards with about 70 on horseback, conquer an empire of 10 million. Well, you need to read a book really to understand the whole thing, all the ins and outs, but that's really the basic story. How did this tiny little group of Europeans conquer this massive empire, which I just described, topographically, it's just vast and populated by 10 million people. And when the classic story about the conquest of the Inca Empire that people have heard about is that Francisco Pizarro goes down there. He captures the Inca Emperor Atahualpa up in the Andes. He holds him hostage on condition that the Incas fill this room up full of gold and silver, with the idea that if they do that, he'll let the emperor go. And the Incas do fill up the room full of gold and silver. And then the Spaniards, being the dastardly people they were back then, they garrote the Inca emperor and kill him, and they conquer the Inca Empire. And that's kind of the nutshell you might read in history books, especially growing up as a kid. But the story that a lot of people don't know is that after killing the Inca emperor, the Spaniards, traveled down through, they were up in the northern part of the Peruvian Andes. They traveled down to Cusco, down in the south, and took it over. And they installed a puppet emperor who quickly died. And so then they found another puppet emperor. It was just a young kid, and his name was Manco Inca, or some people call him Manco Inca II. And he was basically a 17-year-old, noble whose father had been an Inca emperor prior to that. And they set him up thinking, this kid's just a kid, right? He's 17. He's not going to give us any trouble. We'll make him a puppet emperor, and we'll tell him what to tell his people. And because he was an emperor, that people, the Incas, followed his rule. And so the Spaniards successfully controlled this kid for about 3 years. But during those 3 years, as Manco Inca, the young emperor, matured and watched the rapaciousness of the Spaniards, who were busy looting all the temples and stealing their women and making concubines and despoiling everything.
Yeah, I really feel like the Spanish made an error when they take his wife away from him. That seems to be a real breaking point for him.
Yeah, I mean, no offense, in any kind of culture, that would be considered uncool, right? So this is the epitome, as you say, is that this persisted for 3 years, and he got more and more disgusted with what was going on, and finally one of the Pizarro brothers, there were 6 of them, decided he wanted to have Manco Inca's wife, and made that very well known, which is very understandably upsetting to Manco Inca, and then took her.
Yeah,
and that was the straw that broke the camel's back, or broke the alpaca's back, or the llama's back, however you want to phrase it, and secretly, Manco Inca had enough. He sent out word throughout the empire and said, we're going to rebel against the Spaniards. And in total secrecy, amassed this massive army of 200,000 Inca soldiers who crept up, from one end of the empire, the other, they crept towards the city of Cusco. And he started this massive rebellion. And that went on for almost kicked the Spaniards out of Peru.
And there are 2 sites near Cusco where some of these battles went down. Sacsayhuaman, which is right outside of Cusco. Can you talk a little bit about how Manco used that in the Cusco siege?
Yeah, so he sent out secret word to his followers, said, "Hey, we're done with this. Come to Cusco. We're going to attack the Spaniards." And that's where the Spaniards were clustered in Cusco, because that was the capital of the Inca Empire. And so in secret, he amassed an army of 200,000 Inca warriors, and the Spaniards woke up one day, and if you've been to Cusco, Cusco's in the bottom of a valley, high up in the Andes. It's about the elevation of 11,000 feet, 11,300 feet, and it's surrounded by a bowl of mountains, surrounded by hills around the edge of the city. And the Spaniards woke up one day, and all of the hills were full of Inca warriors. They were totally trapped. And it scared the hell out of them, right? Because there were very few, right. A couple hundred of them, and there obviously was like maybe 200,000 warriors sitting there staring at them. What are they going to do? This is it. The goose is up. They're going to die. And make a long story short, they fought a whole series of battles there, and the Incas were up on top of the hill, right above the city. There's a big, massive fortress called Sacsayhuaman. And now it's an archaeological treasure, and tourists go there because they have these massive stones that are compiled there. But it looks like a fortress. There's 3 levels, and to assault the fortress, you have to climb over this series of these big giant stones, and you get over one terrace, and you have to climb up another one, get another one, and up on top was the Inca general who was directing the battles, and there's these 3 big stone towers, and so the Spaniards decided to try to attack. That they had to attack there and take the high fortress, otherwise their goose was cooked. And so there was a whole desperate battle up there on the top of the mountain, and the Spaniards attacked again and again. And one of the Pizarro brothers was killed because Incas had slings when they'd throw stones. He got hit in the head and he died. So that was the first Pizarro brother to go down. But eventually the Spaniards were able to, amazingly enough, seize that fortress, and the Incas then retreated down into the next valley, which was known as the Sacred Valley of the Incas, which is where the Urubamba River runs, which eventually runs around Machu Picchu and down into the Amazon jungle.
And they pull back to another site that is very popular with tourists, Ollantaytambo.
Ollantaytambo.
Yeah, exactly. And that is where they have a battle with the Spaniards that they win. That becomes one of their big victories. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So Manco Inca, he takes up refuge in this other very large fortress temple in the next valley over, and up on the edge of the valley. There's very rugged. There's another big Inca complex, cut stones, and it goes way back. It dates way back, but it's a very beautiful place. Now it's on a tourist destination. It's on the way to Machu Picchu. And again, it's a whole series of terraces, very difficult to overcome. And so he holds up there with his warriors. And also they had Amazonian natives, because the Incas were allied with, some of the tribes in the Amazon. So they had Amazonian natives there had bows and arrows from the lowlands, and they were there as well. And the Spaniards, galloped out of Cusco after their victory and crossed the valley and came up against this big fortress and decided to attack it. And easier said than done, right? Because it was very impregnable, and the Incas had the high ground and had all these stones, stored up. So the slings were slinging these arrows, and the Spaniards are on horseback trying to ride up there, and they're getting flocked by the stones. They're being slung down, and they just were making no headway. And then the Incas very cleverly, there's flatlands down below. They have, the Incas have been practicing agriculture during they're based on agriculture. So they flooded the lowlands. They opened up the dikes and flooded the lowlands. The next thing, the Spaniards are racing around, and suddenly they're in like 3 feet of water. And so it was a total failure on the part of the Spaniards, and they lost a bunch of Spaniards in the battle, and they could not seize the fortress. And so they licked their wounds. They went back to Cusco. So that was like a big victory for the Incas and for Manco too.
It's your book, The Last Days of the Incas. I had read right before going to these various sites, and it really brought them alive, thinking about those various battles. And Sacsayhuaman specifically, I could not even imagine those walls are so extraordinary. How a Spaniard would even be able to get up there while the arrows and the rocks are being flung down. I mean, it's quite a thing to imagine. So thank you for bringing that so much to life.
Yeah, you're welcome. It's just one of the amazing series of archaeological wonders to this day. And of course, there was battles in all of them, and we call them fortresses now, but they had a lot of religious significance. And there's actually, if you walk the Inca Trail, the 4-day trail, you just come across one Inca monument after another, one Inca fortress and religious site. They're scattered along there. So that's one of the great things about the Inca trails, that not only walking through, hiking over majestic Andes, but along the way you're just finding all these Inca ruins that most people, unless you walk that trail, never ever see. You only see Machu Picchu and Cusco. So there's lots of great places like that.
Well, Kim, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. We're going to link to your website and to your various books in the show notes. And with that, I think it's time for the last stop.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the last stop on this train. Everyone, please leave the train.
All right, Ryan, we're here in the last stop. Before I make sure everybody knows what the last stop is, great interview, super compelling, and especially, sadly, for our trip that we're planning, I don't think some of those undiscovered spots in the Andes are going to make it within that radius of flight and expense.
No, I think we need more than a weekend to explore some of those places.
But really compelling. I very much want to check out some of these documentaries.
Yeah, and the book is really fun. He breaks it up into like 9 or 10 different stories. So you're learning about all these different countries and these different sort of characters that have existed, and from Darwin to Pablo Escobar. I mean, it's a good mix of folks.
Well, thank you very much to Kim. But Ryan, we're now here in the last stop. This is the last segment of the show, the final segment of the show. It's my favorite segment. It's your favorite segment. It's popularly known as the People segment. And this is where we each bring just one thing, something that has in some way engaged us since the last episode. And it's a generous moment for us to come together as a community because we share of ourselves. And it could be anything. It could be an anecdote, a memory, a piece of gear, could be a thought, could be an Instagram post, or it could be a 10,000 word article. It could be a book. It could be anything, but it has to inspire the spirit of wanderlust within us, even during the workaday week. So Ryan, I'm anxious to hear, you've obviously been reading, you're fresh back from travel. What is your last stop this week?
So there is this LA Times article that has gone viral amongst my Mexico City friends and a lot of friends who visit Mexico City a lot. And it's about all the work from home folks who are coming. This is specifically from California, but there's been versions of this article that have been written in other places. And how basically, all these folks are driving up prices in some of these major neighborhoods in Mexico City. And there's just so much English being spoken there. And natural wine bars get a call out for opening all over town. And it's just a really interesting piece because it's inspired a lot of conversation. About what does the work from home future look like, where people are sort of less tied to their physical jobs and they can move around a lot, and what does that mean for cities like Mexico City? And it's interesting.
And does it come down generally on a positive side or a negative side?
This article definitely comes down on more of a negative side. Where the rents are going up and food is getting more expensive, et cetera. And they find there's a lot of interesting quotes, digital nomads go home, things like that. So it's definitely more on the negative side. I've spent a lot of time, obviously, in Mexico City, and mostly this is not what you hear. I feel like this was sort of the slant the author wanted to take, but it certainly is an issue that I've heard discussed around the city.
That's pretty interesting, and given that you know boots on the ground and kind of the common man in Mexico City among your friends, how are they feeling about this? Especially because you're one of these. You travel to Mexico City and work remotely.
Well, I was having dinner with a friend a couple weeks ago there, and he was talking about how so many of the real estate listings are not even in pesos anymore; they're in dollars.
Wow!
And obviously, that is a weird thing to see. If you were in Brooklyn and all of a sudden it was the apartment listings were in yen, you'd be like, "Wait a minute, what's going on here?" So I can understand.
Give it a few years. Exactly.
So I can see both sides, and I try not to be. I try not to be one of these loud Americans, taking cell phone calls from my laptop at quiet cafes. But I have been that guy for sure in my life. So just trying to be more aware of that, I think, is important.
Ryan, a Mexico City travel question I've been meaning to ask you. We often joke about your struggle to pronounce certain words in Spanish. And how much Spanish do you speak when you're in Mexico City?
I speak, very minimal Spanish, but I definitely order coffee and things like that. Like I'm not yelling English words at the barista.
But say you're engaging a cab driver. How does that go?
Oh, that wouldn't go very well.
Do you use Google Translate or anything?
Yeah, no, I mean, I do use Google Translate. I used to use it a lot. But from again, the cab conversation I can moderately have, which is like pointing at things.
All right. Yeah. So conversationally, you're okay. I know. I feel like
there would be people who would push back if they heard me say that though. So
I feel like it's like proper nouns that really.
Well, you have like a toddler, so the kind of level of speaking that I could probably get to.
Actually, an interesting side note, and I considered this for my last stop, but I think I'll want to do a future update. Is my son Charlie? In a month, he's starting at a Spanish immersion preschool.
Oh wow!
Yeah,
that's
totally
exciting.
Spanish immersion, and we brought him to take a tour of it, and we were speaking to the teachers, and we said his name's Charlie. And they're all native Spanish speakers. And they said, Charlie's not great for us. Does he have any nicknames? I said, well, we call him Cha-Cha. And they said, oh, Cha-Cha is so much better. It's so much easier for Spanish speakers to say. So he's going to be Cha-Cha.
Yeah, so
Senor Cha-Cha.
once he's been there for about a month, him and I would have similar Spanish language.
I have he's a pretty quick study. I think maybe a day or two he'll be at your level. Well, then you could take him to Mexico City. Great.
Yeah, no, we'd have a good time. He
comes cheap. And fits in overhead storage.
Now, Kieran, did you bring a last stop today?
Of course, I always have a last stop, Ryan. Now, because you and I like to trade travel content throughout the week, I've noticed this major uptick in my Instagram Discover tab, where I'm getting a ton of miniatures. Because
I love that.
They obviously, I looked at some point at a miniature account, or I sent you something, and longtime listeners will know Ryan is obsessive about miniatures.
I love miniatures.
And it reminded me of an attraction, miniature base, that I don't think I have ever shared with you, Ryan. And this reminiscence brought me back so quickly, and I went back to some of my pictures. I'll throw some up on the Instagram, at OOO podcast on Instagram. And it's when a few years ago I went to Malaysia and stayed for a week in Kuala Lumpur, which is the capital of Malaysia. And there's the Islamic Arts Museum there, which is this gorgeous, gorgeous complex with all manner of Islamic art. And, Islamic art obviously is much more focused on patterns instead of figural art. And one of the most striking rooms is full of miniatures. It's called the Architecture Gallery. And what they've done is created miniature versions of all the most famous mosques and Islamic monuments from all over the world. And so that you get to kind of take an international tour of Islamic architecture just in this one room. The detail is spectacular, and they provide write-ups that really make you feel like you understand the basic premise of the architecture. You learn quite a bit about the thought that goes into different types of Islamic architecture, and it takes you across the full Islamic world. And so it's a great study, especially if that's a place you haven't traveled. And so if you find yourself in Kuala Lumpur, this is one of my top picks to visit. It made me realize we never did a Kuala Lumpur episode, and I think there's one in our future.
Well, that sounds fantastic. I love miniatures. It reminds me there was a short-lived New York City experience called Gullivers Gate, and you walked through it, and they had kind of rebuilt all of the world's great cities. And so you kind of got to see the skyline of every major city kind of walking through this sort of junky room in Times Square. But this sounds lovely, Kieran.
Well, it's they have famous monuments like the Taj Mahal is there,
Sure.
but very few that you probably recognize unless you've studied this area. But there's one that really sticks in my mind, and it's a mosque in Mali that's called the Great Mosque of Jain. And it's most famous because it is made of dried mud bricks. And the community actually gets together and repairs this enormous mud mosque every year. And so there's a really interesting Slate article on it. I'll pop that in the show notes as well. And it's very strikingly different looking than the I think what we think of as the grand mosques around the world.
Yeah, no, I've been to a few of those the grand mosques, like specifically the Blue Mosque in Istanbul, which is fantastic. That sounds lovely. So, Kieran, I hear that you have a special guest coming to the pod next episode.
We do. We don't always do interviews back to back, but this one was one that I just didn't want to delay at all. Got to meet one of my favorite writers. So, I'm a real New Yorker junkie, and this is actually our first guest from the New Yorker. And he's not specifically a travel journalist, but had a great travel article. Alex Ross, who has been the longtime music critic at the New Yorker, and is famous, especially in the classical music world. He wrote this spectacular article where he went and visited several small opera houses around Germany. And what he basically dives deep into is the fact that Germany as a state invests incredibly heavily in opera and the arts. And in fact, it's kind of debatable what classifies as an opera house, but there's over 80 opera houses across all of Germany, from the major cities down to towns of 40,000, 30,000 people, where they keep the tickets quite affordable and where it is just a hotbed of operatic creativity. And so he talks about, how productions differ from what you can see anywhere else in the world, and how you can build what he describes as an odyssey, an opera odyssey, across Germany. It's a totally hidden story I'd never been aware of before. And, I'm not a giant opera junkie by any means, but it really made me think I'd love to go see some of these productions.
You could see one part of the Ring cycle in like 4 different cities.
Well, he makes a great point, which is people are encouraged, and tourists and locals alike, to check out these productions because the tickets are kept cheap. Where if you buy a ticket to go to the Met in New York, you're dropping hundreds to go see an opera, and whether the production is quality or not, or you need to wait for the reviews to be out. In Germany, you can, if you have a night free on a trip, see if you're near a local opera house, and you're going to drop $30. And so if it's nothing extraordinary, you can leave, or you can feel like you got your money's worth because you didn't spend that much.
I love that. That sounds awesome. I'm looking forward to the interview.
Really great. So I look forward to that next time.
Well, until then, I'm Ryan Davis.
And I'm Kiernan Schmidt.
And this is Out of Office, your opera podcast.
This seat taken. So, Ryan, you think mountaineering, we could do that trip next year up in the Andes?
Oh, no problem. I'm ready to climb. I'm ready to do the Inca Trail.
I'll make sure that Cha-Cha's brushed up on his Spanish by then.
Muy bien, muy bien.